Citizens Advisory Committee to the Creeks Department, Wednesday, June 20th, 2012. Jen, would you please take roll?
Mr. Moldaver?
Here.
Mr. Bullock?
Here.
Ms. French? Here. Ms. Lomas? Here. Mr. Casebeer?
Here.
Thank you. Can we do an approval of the minutes? Now we have Leanne here.
Mr. Chair, a couple of members said that they weren't present at the last meeting and were planning to abstain from voting on approval of the minutes. And given that we have barely a quorum here with 4 out of 7 members, if we only have 2 voting, I'm not sure that that is sufficient to serve as an approval. So what we can do is put down a note for our next meeting. We will bring up the meeting minutes from our May 2012 meeting as well as from this meeting and approve both of those at the same time. I think that's probably a better way to go.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I was just thinking that if either of the committee members who missed the last meeting were able to watch the video of the meeting, then they would be allowed to cast a vote if they were comfortable doing so. So did either of the 2 who plan to abstain actually watch the broadcast?
No.
In that case, Mr. Chair, I would move that we defer consideration of the May minutes to the next meeting.
I agree. We'll defer the approval. And thanks for that question. Yeah. Any adjustments to today's agenda? Mr. Benson?
No adjustments, Mr. Chair. I did have a couple of announcements to make. The first one, and maybe most important to all of you, is I will be out of town next month during our regularly scheduled meeting on July 18th. And so I talked to the chair before the meeting and agreed that it was probably best if we just cancel that meeting, and we will reconvene in August for our regularly scheduled meeting then. Secondly, I wanted to let you all know that the City Council voted and approved the city budget yesterday, and the Creeks Division budget was adopted by City Council and approved in the same form that the committee had approved back in April. And then lastly, and I think Mr. Bullock or Mr. Moldaver wanted to make some comments about the hearing that was held with regard to Measure B funds use for a project at the Bird Refuge and for a litigation settlement with the Santa Barbara Channel Keeper. But lastly, I just wanted to announce that this committee has been very involved with the proposed Mason Bridge replacement project, and that project will be going to the City Council on July 17th for a hearing to get council direction to the Historic Landmarks Commission on a variety of different design items.
Thank you very much. Mr. Moldaver, would you like to make comments regarding that hearing?
I think those comments would come in better under item number 6, committee member and staff communications. Maybe we could take the public comment first.
Sounds good. Are there any members of the public who would like to make a comment at this point? No? Okay, thank you. So then moving on, Mr. Moldaver.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A week ago, Wednesday, there was a very interesting conversation with the City Council related to the budget process, where there was a discussion of the original intended purpose of the measure that funds our program and what other kinds of projects might be construed to be potentially eligible. And I think it was really constructive to bring the entire council into the conversation about the history of Measure B, the work of the committee, some of the intended and original restrictions on the use of the funds, because as the council has turned over in the years since Measure B was passed and the committee was created. Some of the institutional memory had become a little bit frayed, but it was a very positive, constructive discussion, and it was also very heartening to see several of the people who originally ran the community-wide campaign in support of Measure B, including Jeff Young and Brian Troutwine, and original committee members Daniel Hockman and Sharon Main and Karen Feeney, as well as a number of other people from the public, as well as our distinguished chair representing the Santa Barbara Greater Lodging and Restaurant Association, adding to the council's knowledge and understanding. And it was very heartening that although not every member of the council unanimously agreed with the interpretation of Measure B, I thought it was very positive that after all the explanation and discussion with the community, that the council voted 6-1 to leave things as they are now, and to recognize that the bird refuge project, which had already been completed, would be funded through the normal revenue sources as originally intended, and that the settlement for alleged sewer system leaks would be handled through an adjustment of sewer user fees. And I thought just individually that after 5 years in the middle of a mini depression where flexible funds are scarce all throughout the city and with every agency in California, I could understand why some people with the council wanted to be refreshed about why they shouldn't use Measure B to pay these ancillary bills. But I thought it was really great not only that our chair and our staff testified so effectively, but that so many different people from the community showed up to actually fill the chamber and encourage the council to support Measure B and do the right thing. So I thought it was a very interesting and full conversation that ended up well for creeks and watersheds.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it was a good synopsis. Any other member communications? No? Further staff communications, Cameron? No? Okay, then moving on to the business items. We have Mr. Rumbley here, the Code Enforcement Officer. He's going to give us the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Jim Rumbley. I'm a Code Enforcement Officer for the Creeks Division. Been with the Creeks Division for just over 3 years now. And this presentation is going to be a status report of our program and a little bit of a refresher for those of you that have heard me say something similar before. We'll talk about the program and give you an overview of it as well. The objective of our program is to identify and eliminate sources of water pollution to the city's streets, storm drains, creeks, and the ocean. Chapter 16 of our municipal code deals with water pollution and specifically illicit discharges. I have a list of common discharges that we see that this municipal code prohibits as well. Construction runoff is one that we see quite a bit. This consists of sediment runoff during rainstorms with inadequate erosion control measures. Another example would be when concrete's poured. Sometimes it's spilled in the street and it gets washed down. Construction workers washing off paintbrushes, that sort of thing, into the street. Also prohibited by this ordinance is all washing on commercial property. This can include washing a car on commercial property. It can include washing a building, washing your parking lot. All of that water must be captured. Mobile business washing is also prohibited. This is someone who might come to your home or your office and wash your car for you. That's fine, but the water must be captured and can't be discharged into the storm drain. All vehicle leaks are prohibited. This includes hydrocarbons of any type. Any amount of hydrocarbons is a violation of the code. Illegal dumping is also prohibited by this section of code. Rarely do we catch people who are in violation of this, but we do try to get it cleaned up. And this includes dumping a mattress in the creek, that sort of thing. Any type of trash thrown in the creek. Essentially, you can think of it as anything other than clean water placed in the storm drain system is a violation of this code. This is a list of discharges that are exempt from Chapter 16. Now, it's important to note that these are uncontaminated discharges. Contaminated discharges are defined, and I paraphrase a little bit, anything that might cause disease or poisoning. I won't talk about all of these, but some of them of note. Crawl space pumps, you might have seen this. Generally, we see water coming out of curb drains in the street. It looks like clean water. Not always, but the groundwater in certain places throughout the city is pretty high, and people will have these pumps in their basement. When their basement fills up, the pump turns on, and water is discharged. And generally, if it's clean water, that's exempt. Individual residential automobile car washing is also exempt, although we discourage it when we get calls about it, and it would be preferable if people captured the water instead of letting it run into the drain. It's exempt. It would be better if people would wash the car on their lawn or use a wet dry vac to capture the discharge, but it's an exempt discharge. And street and sidewalk washing. We get lots of calls about this. Somebody's out there washing the street or the sidewalk. And as long as it's, they're not using bleach or some other type of substance that would cause poisoning, it's an exempt discharge. You're allowed to wash the street and sidewalk. We track every call that comes in, and we sort who calls in based on four categories. We have Creeks Division staff, other city staff, city residents, and other agency staff. Other agency staff includes nonprofit organizations like Channel Keeper and Heal the Ocean, and it also includes other agencies like the county. Makes up a small proportion of our calls, 7% this year, 8% historically. Creeks Division staff combined with other city staff makes up around half of all of our calls. A little bit more this year than in years past. For the fourth category, residents make up the largest proportion of all calls we receive, 37% so far this year. And to note, all of my numbers for fiscal year 2012 are so far through May, end of May. Our enforcement line is 897-2688. This is a line that can be used to report any type of water pollution, anything thrown in the creek, that sort of thing. It's monitored during our regular business hours, and if I'm out in the field, I'll forward this line to my cell phone. You're likely to get me if you call this number during business hours. For emergencies, you can always call the fire department or 911 if it's outside of business hours, and they can respond for enforcement and cleanup. So I'm the primary code enforcement officer for the Creeks Division, but we do have additional staff that can respond when needed if I'm out on vacation or we have heavy call volume and need several officers to respond at one time. We coordinate with several different divisions within the city and also some other agencies. For Environmental Services Division, they mainly deal with solid waste. And if we get a call that's solid waste, we can transfer it to them, and they're really good about transferring the calls they receive for water pollution to us. For the Wastewater Division, they're mainly transferring or reporting sewage spills to us. They let us know when that happens. Building and Safety, these are mainly construction-related discharges. If building and safety inspectors are on a project that they're having problems with erosion, running off the site, inadequate erosion control measures, we get calls from them. And likewise, if I see a building and safety violation, I can transfer for calls to them. Our Water Supply Division, this is mostly for waste of water calls. We get calls, we go out and see that there's no violation, it's an exempt type of discharge, irrigation, water runoff. I can transfer it over to Water Supply, and they can go out and do some outreach and try to prohibit that from happening again. For police and fire, police, we mainly deal with them with encampments, and fire will call us for car fires, fires where there's some kind of discharge into the street. And these other agencies listed here, we do work with them occasionally, but on a more seldom basis. It's our goal to investigate every report that we receive on the same day that we receive it. So far, through May of this year, we've responded to calls on the same day that we receive them 99% of the time. When we go out and observe a violation, the first thing that we want to do is stop the discharge. We want to make sure that no additional pollutant is put into the storm drain system. And after that discharge is stopped, then we turn to education. We want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. I'll suggest ways that they can do things a different way in the future. We're not out to fine people, although we do that. We just want to let people know that what they're doing is not allowed. And generally the reaction that I get when I talk to someone about a violation is, I didn't know. And we see that a lot. Generally people are concerned that they've done something wrong and want to make it right. That's the reaction that I get, 90-95% of the time. When I'm on site for a violation, we require cleanup. If there's something left in the street, we want to get it cleaned up. If we do witness the violation, we send out a notice of violation, warning letter, or a fine. And whether it's a fine or a warning depends on whether it's the first violation that person has committed within 12 months. First violation within 12 months, it's a warning letter. Everybody gets a warning. After that, second plus offense within 12 months is a fine. When there's a spill that we can't get cleaned up right away on site, sometimes it just has to wait. We can't get a hold of the property owner, or the person responsible just doesn't have what they need to get it cleaned up. When I send that warning letter or fine, we'll give a cleanup deadline, and that deadline ranges from 2 to 7 days, depending on how big the spill is, how big of a problem it is it's going to be to clean up. After that time period expires, if the cleanup hasn't been completed, we'll issue a citation. This is a chart that shows our fine structure. I mentioned for the first offense, everyone gets a warning letter. If there is a cleanup required and I give a deadline, after that deadline passes on the first offense, it's a $100 fine. When I send out a letter for that $100 fine, a new deadline will be issued, and if that deadline passes and the spill is still not cleaned up, it's $100 per day. After that, we'll forward the case to the city attorney or the regional water board that can enforce with stiffer penalties. For a second violation within 12 months, there's no benefit of a warning, and it's an automatic $200 fine, and the fine steps up from $100 a day to $200 per day. And similarly, for the third offense within 12 months, it's an automatic $250 fine with a $250 fine per day after that. There are some exceptions to sending NOVs. We don't, for the vast majority of calls that we go out on, NOVs are not issued. There's 4 types of reasons why an NOV might not be issued when we go out on a call. One is that we don't see a discharge. Maybe we got there too late, or it was a bogus call. That happens very rarely, but occasionally we don't see a discharge, whether it's exempt or not. And that's the second type, an exempt discharge. It's one of those of that long list that we talked about earlier. Sometimes we go out on calls and we just can't find who's responsible. Maybe we got there a little late, or somebody dumped something and took off, and we can't find who did it. The fourth reason would be that the violation occurs in another jurisdiction, like the county, or it's the responsibility of another agency. For example, a waste of water call, or a building and safety violation, or a solid waste type of offense. This is a chart showing the sources of illicit discharges. We have 6 categories. You know, every call that we get, we categorize. And the most common one is the commercial industrial category, and this is any type of business or any industrial operation. It could be restaurant washing, any type of commercial washing, any industrial discharge. 37% so far this year, and pretty close to our numbers from FY07 to present. Illegal dumping is the second most common report, and like I mentioned before, we rarely catch the people that do this. When something gets dumped, it's usually a mobile violation. They're dumping and running, and we don't commonly catch them. And this category includes dumping in the street, dumping in the creek. Residential is the third category that we receive the most calls for, and it's about 14% so far this year, a little bit less than in years past, and I would like to think this is due to some outreach, but don't really know. Construction makes up about 13% so far this year, and when I was putting these together, that was one thing that kind of surprised me. I really thought construction would be a higher percentage of the calls that we receive, and I think it's because a lot of times those are the discharges that really stick in my mind. They're the ones that require a nasty cleanup. It's something that is in the street, and you'll see some pictures a little bit later, and it creates a real mess a lot of times. And automotive is the 5th most common report that we get, and this includes RVs dumping, automotive shops, and also any types of oil leaks from cars are included in this category. Mobile businesses is another category. These are the guys that wash your car, will come to your house and clean your car. Anything that doesn't fit into these previous categories, we lump into the other category. An example of this would be like a fire hydrant discharge. Someone calls in about water running down the street. It turns out it's a city fire hydrant that's dechlorinated and running into the gutter. Another example would be guys pumping a vault in the street. This is some enforcement data from the last 5 years, starting in fiscal year 08 to present. And so far this year, we've received 209 calls. And the last 4 years, it's been pretty steady, around 200 calls a year. I checked this morning, and we were up to 228 for the year. So we've increased the last 4 years, but we're not yet back to the 2008 levels of 290 calls. And we also issue, a similar amount of NOVs each year. And you can see 209 calls so far on these stats, and only 72 NOVs issued. So it's less than half of the calls usually that we actually issue NOVs. And I mentioned before that our goal is not to fine people, and you can see that we've only issued $1,000 in fines or about that in the last few years. And this is five citations out of 72. What we're seeing is not a lot of repeat offenders. I think that people get the message, for the most part, that once they get a little education and know that what they're doing is not okay, we don't generally see it again. And the last line there is the percentage of calls that we receive that we respond to on the same day. And so far, 99%, and we've gone up from 72 to 95 to 98 to 99 this year. Not perfect. Maybe one of these years we'll get to 100%. That'd be nice, but we're getting close. And this last slide, I just put several photos on here that show you the type of violation that we see typically. The one at the top is a wash water discharge. You can see the soapy water there. Top right is a construction discharge of some sediment, a lot of sediment from a construction site. The one on the lower left is some tile. They had some red tile that they were washing, and they said it was just clay, but it looks pretty awful. And the last one there is paint. paint that was just washed off and then hosed down. So that's all I've got for you. Do you have any questions for me? Sure.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Jim. That was really helpful. I had two very minor questions. I think you mentioned under illegal discharges any hydrocarbons.
Yes.
When we drive our car, don't we have hydrocarbon emissions
Yeah.
out of our tailpipe? So how can that be illegal unless you're going to arrest everybody?
Yeah, and in practice, that is a violation that is very hard to enforce. Your emissions, that are into the air, wouldn't be into the storm drain system, so that wouldn't be a violation. But we do see oil dripping out of cars, that sort of thing. But
Condensation. And
sorry.
the condensation, it's got to be.
Yeah. In practice, we don't send warning letters for that sort of thing. We do outreach a lot of the time because with our administrative citation program, we generally need a parcel to tie violations to, and a lot of times with vehicles, we don't know, where they're from. We see a mess in the street, we try to get it cleaned up, but although it's definitely a violation according to our municipal code, in practice, it's not something that we're able to effectively enforce.
Okay. And my last question is, this last slide you show paint on the curb. Is there an alternative? The city paints their curbs all the time. We paint lines down the middle of the street.
Yeah, well, in this particular photo, it's kind of hard to see. It's a little bit dark, but here this is all.
Oh, it's paint in the drain.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a construction project where someone had their brushes and they just rinsed out their brushes or dumped a bucket of paint in the gutter. It's real.
I thought you were referring to the red paint on the curb from this perspective. So
Yeah.
good. Okay. Thank you for answering my questions.
Sure.
Jim, I was just curious, how many cases on an average go to the district attorney? If at all.
Yeah, that's something that we're actually pretty excited about. Up until last month, we didn't really realize that was an option. And there is a new task force that the county district attorney has started for code enforcement officers, and it's on environmental crime. And they're really interested in pursuing violations. It would really take the right case. They want photos, names, video if possible, and that's definitely a goal of ours. One thing that I got excited about is particularly for RV dumping. A lot of times, an RV will dump, and there's not much we can do. But the district attorney has expressed that they were interested in pursuing something like that. So that's one of our goals, to pursue more cases with the district attorney for this year.
Tasha?
I just was going to add that the DA's office also assigned a DA investigator to help with these cases for all the agencies. So they also have staff to help the city.
All right, thank you, Jim. Looks like you're being kept busy there.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. All right, next up on the agenda is Dr. Murray, who's going to give us a water quality and monitoring program update.
Good evening. So this is the end of the year update. I'll be talking about several of the different brief results that we've obtained in the past year, and then talk about some changes to the monitoring plan for the next year, and then ask for your recommendation. The monitoring plan itself is attached, and so we may be referring to that towards the end of the presentation. Oh, perfect time to mention that in addition to Jim's busy job as our code enforcement officer, he is also works approximately half-time as collecting our water quality samples from the creeks and drains. He is very busy. That's him. So the goals of our monitoring and research program are to understand what types of pollution and contaminants we have in creeks and what their impacts may be to aquatic organisms and humans who may be recreating in those waters and at downstream areas such as beaches. That generally involves understanding which pollutants are there, but also identifying what the appropriate criteria are to compare the concentrations against. We also seek to evaluate the effectiveness of our water quality improvement and restoration projects, and this would involve collecting baseline data for future projects and also involves assisting with the operations and maintenance of projects, so understanding if a facility continues to treat the water, for example. And when we understand that we have a pollution problem in the creeks, then we want to understand how that pollutant is getting to the creeks and the storm drains that feed the creeks. And then towards one of the most common questions that we get from the public is water quality getting better over time? We're always trying to continue building long-term data sets that we can hopefully answer that question eventually. And we do all this so that we can inform our strategies towards which projects we're going to be looking for, how those projects would be designed, what programs we might be thinking about, and also to communicate with the public about what the quality of water is in our creeks and our beaches. This program is, as opposed to some programs that might be more geared almost entirely towards long-term monitoring and a lot of spatial monitoring, almost everything we do is really question-driven, and so you'll see that the monitoring plan is organized by questions. And it's not that we can answer each of those questions every year, but that we're collecting data in support of building answers for those questions. And so the research plan is divided into several sections: our general watershed assessment, storm monitoring, our restoration and water quality assessment, source tracking and illicit discharge detections. Some of that goes hand in hand with what Jim's doing, but basically here we're trying to find the hidden illicit discharges, not the ones that people call in about. And we do creek walks and also conduct bioassessment, which you've heard about in separate presentations. So now I'm going to move through some brief results from last year. We sampled several storms, but the one I'll talk about is our first flush sampling, and that's where we try to collect the earliest runoff that we can after the long summer season, and that's when pollutants accumulate on the streets, sidewalks, parking lots, and runoff. Usually the first rainstorm isn't a really hard rainstorm, so you get all of these pollutants washed off by a small amount of water, and so you get some of the highest concentrations that the aquatic organisms are faced with throughout the entire year. And so we always, every year we sample our downstream integrator sites, we call them, for each of our main creeks: Arroyo Burro, Mission Creek, Laguna Channel, and Sycamore Creek. And they're called integrator sites because it basically takes the runoff from the entire watershed, and we can sample right at that downstream point. We started sampling storm drains directly 2 years ago, and we've continued to do that. And we test for a whole suite of metals, surfactants, pesticides, hydrocarbons, and we have the samples tested for toxicity as well. And 2 years ago, we started adding some new pesticide testing that was recommended by a state-funded project. So this shows the map. Shows some of the storm drains that we sampled. They were in the Laguna watershed, and we chose to focus on Laguna this year because in the past, Laguna Channel integrator site, which is down by Chase Palm Park, has had some of the only toxicity problems during storm events. And so that's the Laguna Channel integrator site, and there's the Mission Creek integrator site. This graph shows the process of the storm. So this flow is in Sycamore Creek, and before there was even measurable rainfall, which is the blue line, and this was measurable rainfall at the county building on Anapamu. Before there was even measurable rainfall, we could see that this storm was coming and that the gutters were starting to flow. I guess I should say measurable rainfall at that site. So as soon as we were getting that earliest runoff, we were out sampling the storm drains. That's first. And then once we could tell that a sufficient amount of that flow had reached the integrator stations, we sampled there. So we started about 5 in the morning and went to about 9:15. And this was an unusual first flush in that it did end up having about an inch of rain. So it was a pretty big storm for the first rainfall of the year. And we often don't get, oftentimes